Our Civil War exhibit is very specific for all of Madison County. The pictures of the individuals and the gravestones are of Madison County soldiers, people who were born here or people who lived their lives here. Their gravestones are designated as that of a Civil War veteran with a specific stone like this man, George Bowner, who is buried at the Perkinsville Cemetery. His stone is white granite. It stands about 2.5 feet tall. It has a shield on it with his name and the company he served with. The 19th Indiana Infantry, all volunteer, had a lot of Madison County soldiers in it. And it fought at some of the biggest battles: Gainesville, South Mountain, Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and on and on. One of the soldiers in the 19th was George Bowner. He was born in Germany in 1844 and migrated to America as a 6-year-old with his grandmother. He came with his grandmother, and evidently things were pretty bad in Germany because this was their only option. He somehow got connected with an Anderson, Madison County family and worked for them. And in 1860, he was an apprentice for a blacksmith across from our courthouse. In 1861, the Civil War began and George Bowner signed up with the 19th Indiana Infantry Regiment, Company A, and fought in all the battles. When his 3-year term was over, sometime after Gettysburg, George re-enlisted and rejoined his unit and fought in the Battle of the Wilderness. There, he was taken prisoner and sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, the worst. George managed to survive there for about 10 months until the end of the war. George was released, and for the first time in his life, he had a chance to make his own decisions. After all, he'd been a bond boy, an apprentice, a soldier, always told what to do, but now he had a chance to make his own decisions. He came back to Madison County. He'd seen a lot of America, but he came back here, to this land and these people. He was the village blacksmith at Perkinsville. He married and raised a family. Descendants still live in the area today. Another good story from the 19th is George Washington Marquis from Summitville. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, George had mini balls go through his knee. Doctors used the word through to mean the bullets didn't hit any bone. And thinking they could save the leg, thinking it would heal, the doctors sent him for long-term care in Washington, D.C. At this point, George's sister Elizabeth received a letter alerting the family of his injury and location. She decided to go to Washington, D.C. and help take care of her brother. This was not uncommon. Family members often went to the aid of their sons in convalescence. During his hospital stay, George's leg developed complications, and the doctors considered amputation. But Elizabeth was a strong-willed woman, and she refused to allow the doctors to operate. She went to the highest authority in the land, Abraham Lincoln. She said, "Release him to me. I will take him back home, and I will take care of him." Lincoln ordered George released into her care, and the leg was not amputated. Elizabeth took George home to Indiana, and although it took nearly a year, he walked again. George later married, had a family, and is buried at the Summitville Cemetery. We have other short stories like Captain Alonzo Makepeace. He was a captain in the 19th, and he was in some of the major battles of the war, Antietam, South Mountain, and Gainesville. He was captured at Gettysburg. Now a POW, he was sent to a prison in South Carolina. He managed to escape in 1864, but he was recaptured. At the end of the war, the Confederates released him, and his men looked forward to seeing him again. We have the Gilmore boys from the 19th. They were from a pioneer family in Adams Township. Morris and John both enlisted in the 19th Indiana Infantry. Morris was killed at Antietam, and he is buried there. John was wounded, returned home, raised a family, and lived in the house his grandfather built in 1838. The 19th Indiana was called the Iron Brigade because of everything it went through. It was always in the forefront of battles, always the first in and the last out. There was a big turnover of men. General McClellan saw them marching down a road, so resolute, so strong, so determined. He asked, "Who are those soldiers?" One of his aides replied that they were from the western area, meaning Indiana. McClellan responded, "They look like iron." We have men that our soldiers admired. One was Isaac May, who was a major in the 19th Indiana. This portrait hung in the GAR Hall for many years. This is a very large, detailed black and white portrait of him in his beard, his uniform, his sword, and his jacket. He was killed at Gainesville, Virginia. His body was never recovered. After the war, as the Grand Army of the Republic was organized, the GAR post in Anderson was named for Major Isaac May. The GAR was the social, political, support, and philanthropic group for the veterans. Another GAR post honoree was Major Samuel Henry. He was in the 34th Indiana Infantry, and this particular unit was engaged in the Western Theater, which was in Missouri, Arkansas, and west of the Mississippi River into Texas. While in Missouri, Samuel Henry from Pendleton was a major in that unit. He was kidnapped, not by soldiers from the South, but by guerrillas from the South. Unorganized, non-military renegades out to rob, kill, destroy whatever northern people they encountered. Major Henry was kidnapped by guerrillas, murdered in cold blood because he was a northern officer. After the war, this memorial plaque was named in his honor, the Samuel Henry Guards from the 89th Infantry. We have everyday soldiers in the exhibit. This is Private Jefferson Seibert. There are two photographs of him, one in his uniform and one later with his wife. The Seiberts were a pioneer family in Fall Creek Township. Jefferson Seibert fought at Munfordville, Vicksburg, Nashville, and at the Siege of Mobile, Alabama. He was discharged in July of 1865. Another man that our soldiers admired was General George Thomas. He was the general at the battles of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Nashville. Big, difficult, important engagements. His men called him Pap because he took care of them. He made sure they had all the food they wanted and anything else they needed. When asked for their devotion, they gave it to him readily. This particular picture and frame hung in the GAR Hall for decades because the men remembered Pap Thomas and how he took care of them. General Thomas won the battles for them. In fact, he was called the Rock of Chickamauga because the Army of the Cumberland, which he commanded, had to stay put on their line while other units were escaping a dangerous situation to the left and right. He was told to hold that line, and he did. He told his soldiers to, and they did. They saved the Union Army at that point at Chickamauga. The 34th Indiana Volunteer Infantry was actually formed in Anderson. Its camp was located where the Anderson Country Club is now. At that time, one of Anderson's attorneys, Thomas Stillwell, was a good friend of Indiana Governor Oliver Morton. Governor Morton called for more volunteers and asked Stillwell to organize some units, to which Stillwell agreed. The camp was on part of the Stillwell property, so it was aptly named Camp Stillwell. Stillwell organized the 34th Indiana Volunteer Infantry of men from Madison County and other surrounding counties. We have photographs of Quartermaster David Carver from Alexandria and Isham Benefiel from Elwood. We also have photos of soldiers, Private William Grant from Kokomo and Houston Day from Jonesboro. From this region, the 34th was commanded, and it was involved in the last battle of the Civil War at Palmetto Ranch in southern Texas in May 1865. News services and communications were slow in 1865, and the soldiers had not received the word yet that the war was over. So they kept on fighting, and the 34th was involved in the very last battle of the Civil War. We have photos of Jasper Huffman, whose family lived in Madison County near Lapel. One photo is of him in uniform, and the other is with his family later in life at the family farm that was located on what is now State Road 13 and County Road 400 West. Some of the ordinary soldiers later became attorneys and judges, such as Judge Harvey Craven. He had fought for the 89th Infantry, serving at the major battles of Vicksburg and Munfordville. Eventually, he was promoted to the rank of colonel, but he returned to Madison County. He was called Rough and Ready. One of the many things we have today that might be taken for granted that the Civil War gave us is embalming.
Tell me, weary soldier, from the root.
Until the Civil War, most people buried their relatives on their own land, as most were farmers. The dead were buried at the back of a property away from the living. But the Civil War was a completely different situation. There were sons, sometimes daughters, 3 or 4 states away. When one died, the officials had to figure out a way to send the body home before it began to decompose. Embalming became the solution. Here's an early photograph showing Civil War doctors learning the art of embalming a body. The doctors observe while one demonstrates how to insert the needle into the vein in the leg. That is where the blood was extracted and the formaldehyde then pumped in. This is another photograph of a surgeon demonstrating how to amputate a leg.
Was my brother in the battle when the noble Highland host.
When visiting the exhibit, note the bullets in the black and red case. In the upper left-hand corner is a white bullet called a mini ball. At the bottom and around the base of the bullet are the marks of human teeth. This bullet was used during surgery. If doctors ran out of chloroform, alcohol, or other anesthetics, the operations had to continue, whether it was basic or as complicated as an amputation. The patient was given a bullet to bite down on. The marks on this bullet are the imprints of human molars. The person nearly bit through the bullet. Daniel Clymer from Duck Creek Township participated in several campaigns, helping pursue Confederate raider John Hunt Morgan and his men throughout southern Indiana and Kentucky. However, most of Clymer's service was spent as a teamster, hauling supplies and equipment for the Union Army in wagons pulled by horses or mules. After the war, Clymer was appointed to select mules for the standing U.S. Army. This is the gravesite of the Ryans, Townsend and his wife Susan, an older couple who both have military, government, Civil War headstones, the white granite with the shield in the middle, which means they recognize Susan for her years of service as a nurse at the hospitals in St. Louis and Memphis. Her husband, Townsend, went in as a doctor in the later years of the war. They are buried side by side with their matching markers at West Maplewood Cemetery in Anderson. Here we have the 5 Heidi brothers from Green Township: Archibald, Thomas, John Henry, Jacob, and Joseph. All 5 served for 3 years. All served in major battles. And miraculously, all survived. They all married and raised families. The Cottrells were also from Green Township. 4 Cottrells served in the Civil War, 3 brothers and a cousin. The cousin was wounded at Vicksburg and later died in a hospital in Missouri. Of the 3 brothers, Samuel, Thomas, and William, Samuel was killed in 1862. But Thomas and William survived and had families here in Madison County. Their tombstones are new, but they are just like the ones used originally after the war. They are still granite, they are still white, and they still have the shield with the name, rank, and service of the particular individual. These are new replacement stones provided by the Madison County Cemetery Commission. Sister Victoria O'Keeffe, born in Ireland, immigrated in 1847, came to Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana, to study at St. Mary's Convent. She was among the nuns who went into Kentucky and Illinois to work in the military hospitals. She did that for 4 years. And after the war, she came to Anderson, where she was the directress of St. Mary's School and a superior at St. John's Hospital. From Indiana, Francis Van Pelt rose from private to captain. He was in the 17th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, enlisted in early April 1861. He was in Company G, was at the Battle of Shiloh, one of the first worst battles, double promotion. And I'm assuming the way it's written up on the field, because others were dying at the time he was there. He went from private to sergeant and then sergeant to lieutenant for, quote unquote, meritorious service during that battle. He later was promoted again at the end of 1862 to first lieutenant. And then he was given a command of his own company during the Battle of Chickamauga. So he served under General Thomas. And that command of his own company continued through the Battle of Hoover's Gap and into the siege of Chattanooga. So they gave him a special assignment. They took his infantry unit and changed it into a mounted contingency, from infantry to a cavalry type unit. And they sent him into Farmington, Tennessee, where his company captured 3 Confederate cannon and actually drove the enemy back. He was told, go into Nelson County, Kentucky, and hunt out the guerrillas, the non-military troublemakers who are just killing people because they happen to be from the north or whatever. He had 60 men. That's what they did at one point. He was chasing down 3 of the enemy. Captain Francis Van Pelt asked his horse to take a very difficult jump. Evidently, he misjudged how difficult it was because the horse and he became separated in midair. He came off and hit the ground. He was stunned for a little bit, but then he jumped up, grabbed the horse, remounted, went after the enemy again. He cornered them somehow and held a gun to their heads and said, you're gonna surrender and you're gonna surrender now. He found out later he had been injured when he fell. They took him to a convalescent camp to get better. It took him a while. But when he was released, he came back into service and finished out the war during the capture of Atlanta. Later in life, he was Justice of the Peace here in Anderson for a number of years. And then there's Charles Doxey. This guy I keep running into in history books on Madison County. He was with the 16th Indiana Infantry, started out as a sergeant, had to take command of the regiment at one point because the officers had been killed. At the Battle of Pleasant Hill, he was wounded twice, once in the face and once in the knee. In later life, in Anderson, he was a businessman, he was a U.S. congressman, he built several buildings here. Even the Grand Opera House was his.
One of the many artifacts of the Civil War is the Easel Monument Plaque. This was a movement after the Civil War to create monuments in many of the larger cities. The plaques were sold to fund the monuments, but due to a lack of subscriptions, the monuments were never built. However, many veterans possessed these documents, and they wrote the history of the war service on them. This once belonged to William Henry Prater, who was my wife's ancestor. He lived just south of Pendleton, near the Minden Cemetery. He fought in the 89th Indiana, Company B. There are 5 members of Company B buried in the Minden Cemetery. There were very few families living in America at that time that did not have members fighting in the Civil War. Then the next object we moved to is a Civil War drum, which I own, and it was carried by Samuel Baker from Brookville, Indiana. The drum, the drumsticks, and the carrying strap, and it came from his stepfather, who was the brother of Samuel Baker. So once I got the drum, then my wife and I did research. She's the genealogist, and figured out the brother was the musician. The stepfather of this gentleman was too old to be in the Civil War, so it had to have been Samuel Baker's. The odd part is Samuel Baker's unit also fought in a battle in Kentucky, Munfordville, where Linda's ancestor, William Henry, fought. So there is a chance that this drum was at that battle. One of our really interesting pieces in this museum, a gentleman named Michael Winter, he collects naval stuff, which you just don't see in museum much. But he has these artifacts from George Prescott, who served on the Junata boat, which was part of the blockade ships around the coast of America. The odd thing about him, they took part of his group off, and he led them on land in the attack on Fort Fisher. We have his sword and his sextant. We have his discharge and all of which belong to Michael Winter. At the end of the swords, there's a reinforcing piece called a drag. And if you look at the naval swords, they are dolphins, which is kind of unique. We have one of my swords, a cavalry sword, 1840 model cavalry sword. Then we have a nicer sword below that. It belongs to another gentleman, and another 1840 sword. Next to them in the case are two more swords, another 1840 cavalry saber, and then you look, it has a curve to it, and right below it is an 1850 Army staff field officer sword, in other words, infantry, and you'll notice it's straight. Below that we have a cartridge box, a mirror, and a straight razor that unfortunately did not belong to a Madison County soldier, but all three of these items belong to a soldier from Warsaw, Indiana. Next to that, we have an 1861 44 caliber revolver, Remington revolver, and the serial number of it fits in with the serial numbers of the ones purchased by the federal government for the Civil War. The cylinder in this revolver, its serial number matches a revolver, so it's been with that revolver since it was made. I have another cylinder that fits with it, goes with it. It is not matching serial numbers, but it was common in the Civil War for soldiers to purchase extra cylinders, and they could load them up, change them out of the revolver during battle, and have more firepower. My wife's ancestor fought at the end of the Union line at Munfordville in a place called the Stockade, up on a high hill, so they were protected from the attacking Confederate forces. And a good friend of mine, Ron David, is a metal detector, and he was digging around there and found a frying pan at the Stockade. So once again, here we've got two soldiers that were at Munfordville, and we've got a frying pan that came out of that stockade where one of those soldiers fought. There's also a display of some of the very few different types of the different projectiles in the Civil War. The Civil War was one of the watersheds of the history of America because it created so many different inventions and unfortunately ways to kill people. But there's just a few of the different projectiles used in the Civil War. There's also cannon fuses. They would go in the end of projectiles and they would cut the length of them so they would fly so far before they exploded. And if you look on them, there are markings on them for how many seconds they would fly. Well, another one near the cartridge box is a reproduction of the cartridge that would be used in that cartridge box. The soldiers received their ammunition in this form, and they had to have two teeth, one above and one below, to tear open the cartridge, to pour the powder in the barrel, and then they would literally squeeze out the mini ball into the barrel, and it would be forced down. A muzzle-loading Springfield rifle, we'll get to in a minute, a good soldier could fire 3 rounds a minute. With a Sharps rifle, you could fire 6 rounds a minute. And it could be loaded laying down behind a tree, walking or running, as opposed to the muzzleloaders, which you had to stop and reload. We have a real 1862 Springfield rifle, muzzleloading rifle, on display. Below that is a breech-loading Sharps rifle I just talked about. And below that is another common gun in the Civil War. It's a 2-band Remington firearm as they used in the Civil War, which is quite similar to Springfield, just a little shorter. Also a real Civil War bayonet, Springfield bayonet, and the scabbard it went to, that goes with it, which went on the end of the rifle. The Springfield 1862 rifle, that's because it was made in 1862. It was actually a 1861 model. That was accurate at about 500 yards. The Sharps rifle, the breech-loading rifle, was accurate out to about 1,300 yards. I've been all over the United States, Civil War museums all over the place. The one thing you never see is naval uniforms. And here we have two naval uniforms. We have a U.S. Navy officer's double-breasted swallow coat, model 1852, and we also have an 1864 pattern Union Naval Officer double-breasted frock coat. We have a great coat, they call it, which is what they wore in the winter. And also then in our display case, we have a normal Civil War soldier's uniform, which a reenactor would wear. And if you look at the shirt you have in there, it's a one made at home, a homespun shirt, because their shirts wore out, their underwear wore out, or their socks wore out. The government was not good about replacing them. They depended on the folks at home to supply them with shirts and underwear and socks. That was one of the things that happened. Also, we have the normal thing you see, the normal cap called a kepi, but beside that is a tall black hat, which was common for the 19th Indiana. And you see written, you read Civil War letters from the Confederate soldiers, and one of the things you read time and time again is, oh no, here come the guys in the tall black hats. Because they knew they were in for a fight, because the 19th Indiana stood and fought. So that hat meant trouble to the Confederate soldiers. On the wall, we have an original muster roll, 1862. They fill these out periodically. The officers in the units filled them out, listed all the men's names and anything that had happened to them during that period of time, whether they went AWOL or they were wounded or killed or whatever. Also, if they lost military equipment and were charged for it. All these documents, there were, hundreds of thousands of those created during the Civil War. We happen to have one from the 47th Indiana Volunteers, which was a Madison County unit. But here's a document from 1862 that we still have in our collection. Of course, they used rag paper back there, so it survived as opposed to the material we use now, which doesn't survive. By the way, at the end of the Civil War, there were more Union black troops than there were Confederates left. For those black troops to fight too was quite a thing, because if they were captured, they did not fare well in the Confederacy. Many of them, they were not treated as prisoners. They were treated as slaves, what they were. Slave owners could come and claim any of them. They didn't have to have any proof. They could just say, that guy was one of mine, and they could take them. Men that had been born free in the Union long before the Civil War could be put into slavery just by some guy coming up and picking them out of a crowd. That process stopped the exchange of prisoners between the North and the South, which meant men stayed in prison camps in both sides longer, which led to more deaths in the Civil War prison camps.
This is a collection of badges from the Isaac May GAR post. The members of the post would wear these badges during meetings, in parades, signifying their membership of that post. The members wore these badges very proudly. The black-sided badges were worn during periods of mourning for the passing of a comrade in arms. The members would be given the directive to wear the mourning badges from the National Commander-in-Chief or the State Commander of the GAR. The mourning badges were normally worn for a period of 30 days in memory of the departed. Otherwise, they would wear their badges with the red, white, and blue decoration on the reverse side. If you were to study each of the ribbons, you will find differences in them. No two ribbons are the same. Some have obvious differences, some are very subtle. The bottom row in this case are ribbons handed out during the 1903 GAR and the Allied Orders encampment in Anderson, which occurred only once. Anderson bid on having it in 1902, but was denied. They bid the next year and won it for the 1903 encampment. Anderson bid again in 1929, but again was denied. The state GAR held annual encampments once a year in various sites around the state, and cities bid on them. Because there were economic advantages to the city that hosted the veterans and their families for the 3-day event. They came and they spent money, staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, and buying souvenirs. It was an economic boom to have the encampments. Anderson hosted the encampment in 1903, and that's what is unique about this collection of badges. I've never seen one city have so many badges as did Anderson. I've seen many badges from cities where there will be 1, 2, or 3 badges, but Anderson had many different badges, and I'm sure this is not all of them. There were committee badges. If you served on a committee, you wore it. What makes 2 of them very unusual, if you notice, one says chairman at the top of the chairman at the top means it's one kind of badge, since there was only one chairman of a particular committee. This badge was for the Women's Relief Corps, the WRC. Usually they would meet at the same time as the GAR. Both groups together were called the Allied Orders. Official delegates were elected to the state convention by their local post. Each post was entitled to send delegates based upon its membership. For every 10 members, 1 delegate could be sent, and delegates wore the delegate badge. The badge lying horizontally with Chief Anderson at the bottom and includes a key was a souvenir badge handed out to attendants of the 1903 state encampment. 4,000 souvenir badges were made and 6,000 attended, so not everyone received one. The organizers did not anticipate it would be so well attended. The veterans stayed in downtown hotels, but all could not be accommodated. Those who could not find rooms pitched tents at what is now Athletic Park. They walked back and forth from their camp to town. They arrived by railroad, of which there were 3 serving the city at that time: the Panhandle, which later became the Pennsylvania Railroad, the B Line, which became the New York Central, and the Michigan Division of the Big 4 Railroad. All 3 lines served Anderson, making it a good location for a convention because it was an easy destination. The second case contains badges or ribbons from regimental reunions. As with the GAR, regimental associations would form after the war. Men who served in the same regiment developed strong friendships during their service. After the war, they returned to their respective homes. Over the years, the veterans decided to reconnect with their old comrades, so they got together and held a reunion. Those regiments would come together on an annual basis at various cities based upon where the members of the regiments lived. The veterans were invited to attend the reunion, much like the GAR, except there were regimental reunions with the appropriate badge for that event. The Civil War veterans relished wearing the badges. Some of them looked like Russian generals with all the badges pinned to their chests. The badges were a proud mark of their service in the war. This is a collection of ribbons from reunions held in Madison County by various regiments over the years. The reunions were held in Anderson, Elwood, Lapel, and Alexandria, among other places. Two of the badges are from the Lou Taylor Post GAR in Alexandria and the Elwood GAR Post in Elwood. Normally, a post would be named honoring a hero, such as Major May in Anderson or Lou Taylor in Alexandria. Elwood simply called theirs the Elwood Post. There were 8 posts total in Madison County over the years. In the other case is the Major Henry badge from the Pendleton Post, the 4th badge that we have on display. As part of the 1903 encampment, a unique event occurred here, which was the living flag. The pictures seen here are of 2,000 Anderson school children assembled on a large scaffold. The children rehearsed songs they were going to sing for several days. When they arrived, they carried their capes, which were red, white, or blue. They walked up the scaffolding, found their seats, and on command from the school superintendent, they put on their capes, making a spectacular sight. On another command, the children took a white handkerchief and waved it to make the illusion of waving flag, a living flag. 6,000 veterans attended that day for the huge parade in downtown Anderson. They marched in front of the living flag while the children sang patriotic songs. In one instance, as the veterans were passing by, the children were in between songs. One of the students began humming Dixie, which was the song of the Confederacy. Other students began humming along, and the veterans who were 38 years before had been trying to kill the Confederates stopped, removed their hats, and the newspaper accounts record several of them shedding a tear. Obviously, the healing between the enemies had begun. This is the first occurrence in the United States that I can find where there was a living flag. I find it next in Toledo, Ohio in 1908, and I found a living flag in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1909, both locations hosting the GAR national encampments. This was something that, as far as I know, began here in Anderson and extended across the country. The last case on display is devoted to the 34th Indiana, which was the only complete regiment formed in Madison County. It was raised at Camp Stillwell, and the soldiers trained from late August to October 1861, around a 10-week period. At that time, they marched off to the front. The 34th fought mainly in what was called the Western Theater. The Civil War was divided into 3 theaters of operation. The Eastern Theater was everything east of the Allegheny Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. The Western Theater was everything west of the Alleghenies to the Mississippi River. And the 3rd department was called the Trans-Mississippi, meaning everything west of the Mississippi River. The 34th Indiana was predominantly in the Western campaigns. Their biggest fight occurred at Champions Hill in Mississippi in May of 1863. This was a prelude to the Battle of Vicksburg. The other thing the 34th Indiana is most noted for was their service in the Trans-Mississippi Department, where they were engaged in the very last battle of the Civil War that occurred on May 13, 1865, at a place called Palmetto Ranch, east of Brownsville, Texas, along the Rio Grande River. The battle was fought 1 month and 4 days after General Lee had surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. There were a couple of Confederate armies, one under General Kirby Smith, that did not surrender until late April. Although the war was considered over with Appomattox, however, there was still some fighting going on. The soldiers in South Texas did not receive news of the surrender. There was no way to communicate quickly to them in 1865. The 34th engaged in battle with the Confederates at Palmetto Ranch, and oddly enough, it was the only fight that regiment lost throughout the entire war. The unique thing about the regiment is that Jefferson Williams was a member of the 34th and was killed in this battle. Williams holds the dubious distinction of being the last Union soldier killed in the Civil War. His remains were brought back, and he's buried in Jay County, his home, before the war. These ruby red flash glasses were given out as souvenirs during the 1903 state encampment. This is the type of hat that was worn by a member of the GAR when on parade. I've tried it on, and in no way does it fit. My head is much larger than the man who wore this hat, but that is the type of hat that the members wore. This is a composite photograph mentioned in John Faulkner's 1914 History of Madison County. Faulkner discusses the photograph and states the following, quote, "It was taken a couple of years ago," close quote. If one can assume a couple, meaning 2 or 3, the photo was taken in perhaps 1911 or 1912. It is a photograph of the individual members of the Major May post in Anderson, number 244. The photographer was named Clark, whose studio was located across the street on Meridian between 8th and 9th Streets, west of the courthouse. The GAR headquarters were located in the basement of the west side of the courthouse. These photographs were assembled in a composite drawing with the names and units they served in listed on the side. This is a miniature of the larger one in the collection. There was one large composite photograph that was hung in the Major May GR post for years. When the post closed, the photograph went different places. The Historical Society obtained it from the public library. It was water damaged at some point in its life and was nearly ruined. The miniature composite would have been purchased and hung in the home, proudly displaying the fellow comrades of the GAR post. The 7th Indiana Cavalry during a reunion in 1885, the photo was taken on the courthouse steps. The members are holding a picture of an unidentified comrade, so he had meaning to the men, possibly a recently deceased member or someone who did not attend in person, so they brought him in spirit. This picture, we think, was taken probably in 1929 or 1930, outside the northwest corner of the Madison County Courthouse. In the basement of the courthouse was the GAR meeting room. Also, the United Spanish War veterans shared that room. These were Civil War veterans sitting outside the hall. Most likely these men were downtown for a parade because the bushes in the background have no foliage. I'm guessing it's likely to be a Veterans Day parade in November. As you can see, the men are attired in hats carrying walking sticks. We know that this man passes away in 1933. His granddaughter gave us his photograph and told us that. The GAR was a very powerful voting bloc, starting with Ulysses Grant through William McKinley, both Civil War veterans. All the presidents in between, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, were all Civil War veterans, and they were all Republicans elected primarily by the GAR members. So powerful a voting bloc were the GAR that they were almost solidly Republican to a man. They harbored ill feelings towards the Democrats because they blamed the Democratic Party for the Civil War.